When Harold Mitchell claimed he could awaken the millionaire's wife, no one believed the old homeless veteran who slept beneath the Fifth Avenue Bridge. His tattered clothes and grey beard concealed decades of untold stories, but his piercing blue eyes held an intensity that made people stop and pay attention, if only for a moment. He had spent the last 3 years wandering the streets of New York, carrying a worn military backpack and secrets that could change lives forever. No one imagined that this forgotten man held the key to a mystery that haunted one of the city's wealthiest families. Fate was about to reveal that sometimes miracles come from the most unexpected places. The crowd that gathered around Harold that cold December morning included reporters, skeptics, and the merely curious, all drawn by the audacity of his impossible claim. Emma Sterling, wife of tycoon Richard Sterling, had been in a coma for 6 months following a mysterious accident, and the world's finest doctors had long since abandoned any hope of recovery. Harold stood motionless in the chaos, as if he had already lived this moment 1,000 times in his dreams, his fingers trembling slightly as he held a small object inside his coat pocket. His raspy voice cut through the icy air like a blade. "I know what she's living through in there, because I've been to that place myself." His words sent a chill down every spine in the crowd, but Harold knew the most terrifying part was still to come. 3 decades of military service and experiences that defied human logic had prepared Harold for this exact moment, though he never knew when or how it would come. The visible scars on his hands told only part of the story, while the invisible ones etched into his soul held secrets that could either save or destroy lives. He had lost everything: family, career, dignity, but something deep inside whispered that all his suffering had a greater purpose. The cold morning wind carried a scent of both hope and despair, creating an atmosphere that made even the most skeptical question their beliefs. Harold closed his eyes for a brief moment and whispered a prayer he hadn't spoken in years, knowing that in just a few hours he would come face to face with the most powerful man in the city. News of the event spread like wildfire through social media and television networks, turning the homeless man's impossible claim into a national headline. Richard Sterling, known for his ruthless business acumen and emotional unshakability, was about to receive the phone call that would change his life forever. Harold gripped the small object in his pocket more tightly, feeling his heart race as he watched reporters rush back to their vans. He knew there was no turning back, that the events to come would expose truths some people would kill to keep buried. At precisely noon, Harold began walking toward the hospital, carrying with him the last hope for Emma Sterling, and perhaps his own final shot at redemption. Richard Sterling had never known fear like this. For the past 6 months, he had watched his wife Emma wither away in a hospital bed, surrounded by the most advanced medical equipment money could buy. The man who ruled a billion-dollar empire with an iron will now felt utterly powerless in the face of the woman he loved more than life itself. Each beep from the heart monitor echoed in his chest like a countdown to the inevitable, as doctors whispered among themselves with increasingly grim expressions. Emma lay motionless, her pale skin stark against the golden hair fanned out across the pillow, like a sleeping beauty trapped in a macabre fairy tale. Richard held her cold hand every single day, pleading for a miracle that never seemed to come. The accident that had put Emma in that bed haunted Richard every night, filled with details he preferred to forget but could never escape. He had told the same version of events hundreds of times to doctors, investigators, and journalists, but there was always a hesitation in his eyes that suggested deeper layers of truth. Emma had fallen down the stairs at home during what Richard described as a trivial argument, but the nurses had noticed how he avoided talking about the moments leading up to her fall. Her injuries were consistent with the story, but something in her expression that final night continued to torment Richard like a ghost that refused to leave. He often wondered if Emma could hear him when he whispered his apologies into her ear during those long, sleepless nights. When the call about the homeless veteran came to Richard's office, his first reaction was white-hot fury that someone would dare to exploit his personal tragedy. His lawyers and security team were already prepared to sue Harold Mitchell for harassment and extortion, but something in the man's detailed account made Richard hesitate. The veteran had mentioned specific things about Emma that were not public knowledge, including a small scar behind her left ear and her habit of whispering in French when she was afraid. A chill ran down Richard's spine when he learned that Harold had once served at the same military base where Emma had worked as a volunteer nurse years before they were married. The coincidences were piling up in disturbing ways, forcing Richard to consider possibilities that defied his logical, rational mind. The decision to meet Harold Mitchell came in a moment of complete desperation, when Richard realized he had exhausted every conventional means of saving Emma. He instructed his security team to bring the veteran to the hospital discreetly, away from the prying eyes of the media vultures circling the case. Richard knew he was risking his reputation and possibly his sanity by listening to a man the world had cast aside, but something deep within whispered that Harold might be the answer to his desperate prayers. As he waited in the hospital hallway, Richard clutched Emma's wedding ring between his fingers, recalling the promise he had once made to protect her forever. What he didn't know was that some promises carried devastating consequences, and the truth about Emma was far more complex and terrifying than he had ever imagined. The meeting between Harold Mitchell and Richard Sterling took place in a private hospital room where the heavy air carried decades of untold secrets and the electric tension of two lives about to become forever intertwined. Harold entered with his military posture still evident despite years on the streets, his blue eyes meeting Richard's with an intensity that made the millionaire instinctively take a step back. Richard had expected to find a broken man begging for money, but Harold radiated a strange serenity that defied his ragged appearance. The silence between them lasted an eternity before Harold spoke in a voice that carried the weight of invisible battles. "Mr. Sterling, I served with your wife in Afghanistan in 2008, and there are things about that mission she never told you." The revelation hit Richard like a punch to the gut, making him realize he knew far less about Emma than he thought. Harold pulled a faded photograph from his pocket, showing a group of soldiers and nurses at a military base, pointing to a young Emma smiling beside a much younger Harold. Richard examined the image with trembling hands, instantly recognizing the face of the woman he loved, but discovering a chapter of her life that had remained completely hidden. "She saved my life twice on that base," Harold continued. "Once when she patched me up after a mortar attack, and once when she brought me back from a place very much like where she is now." The confession made Richard's blood run cold, as Harold was suggesting that Emma had experienced something similar to her current coma. The two men stared at each other like gladiators in an invisible arena, each holding pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, would reveal disturbing truths about the nature of reality and human consciousness. The memories Harold shared painted a portrait of a courageous woman who had faced unimaginable horrors to save lives during the conflict, but who carried deep psychological scars that had never fully healed. Richard listened in silence as Harold described how Emma had developed a unique ability to connect with soldiers in traumatic shock, almost as if she could enter their minds and guide them back to reality. "She had a gift," Harold explained, "but gifts like that come at a high price for those who bear them." The revelation made Richard question every night Emma had awakened, screaming from nightmares she claimed not to remember. Harold clutched the small object in his pocket more tightly, preparing to reveal the supernatural connection he had shared with Emma since that fateful mission in the desert. The air in the room seemed to grow denser with each word, as if reality itself was bracing to be challenged. Harold's final words before they left the private room echoed in Richard's mind like a dark omen. "Mr. Sterling, your wife is not just in a coma. She's trapped in a place between life and death, and I'm the only living person who knows how to find her there." Richard felt his knees weaken as he tried to process the impossibility of the statement, but something in Harold's absolute conviction forced him to consider that perhaps there were aspects of human consciousness science had yet to understand. The two men walked toward Emma's room in a silence heavy with expectation and terror, each step bringing them closer to a truth that would change their lives forever. Richard looked at Harold one last time before opening the door, no longer seeing a desperate homeless man, but a soldier on a mission that transcended normal human comprehension. Fate had brought these three souls together at a critical moment, and only one of them knew the rules of the deadly game about to begin. Harold froze at Emma's doorway as if struck by lightning, his breathing growing irregular as he looked at the woman who had haunted his dreams for 15 years. The small object in his pocket, an old military medal, began to heat up against his fingers, reacting to Emma's presence in a way that defied all logical explanation. Richard watched Harold with growing unease as he saw tears fall from the veteran's hardened face, who whispered with a broken voice, "She's exactly where I was for 3 days in 2008, when a bomb went off at the base and I was technically dead for 4 minutes. The revelation made Richard's heart pound violently as Harold was suggesting he understood Emma's state through his own near-death experience. Harold approached the bed with reverence, as if stepping onto sacred ground, and explained to Richard how, during those 4 minutes of clinical death, his consciousness had traveled to a place that was neither life nor death. "It's an endless corridor between worlds," Harold murmured, "where lost souls wander, searching for the way back to their bodies." Richard listened in disturbed silence as Harold described how Emma had been his spiritual guide in that impossible place, holding his ethereal hand and whispering instructions in French to help him find his way back to life. The memory of Emma's tendency to whisper in French during moments of fear made Richard realize Harold knew intimate things about his wife that went beyond normal knowledge. The veteran pulled the medal from his pocket, revealing a small silver disc engraved with symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Harold held the military medal between his fingers as if it were a sacred talisman, explaining to Richard that the object had been blessed by a military chaplain moments before the explosion that nearly took his life. "This medal absorbed part of the spiritual energy Emma used to guide me back," Harold revealed, "and since then it served as a bridge between our worlds." Richard watched with growing discomfort as Harold began to murmur in a language he didn't recognize, moving the medal across Emma's forehead in circular patterns that seemed to follow some ancient, mysterious geometry. The room's temperature visibly began to drop, causing the air to condense into small clouds as Harold continued his unconventional ritual. The sound of the medical equipment began to waver almost imperceptibly, as if reality itself was responding to the presence of the medal. Richard was about to interrupt what he considered a display of charlatanism when he noticed Emma's heart monitor displaying patterns he had never seen before. Harold placed the medal on Emma's chest and whispered, "I know you can hear me, Emma. I will find you in that corridor, but this time I'll be your guide back home." The words echoed in the room with supernatural intensity, sending chills down Richard's spine as he watched Emma's expression subtly change for the first time in 6 months. The veteran closed his eyes and began to breathe in a controlled rhythm, as if preparing for a journey no human being should willingly take. The first signs that something extraordinary was happening began as almost imperceptible whispers escaping Emma's lips, words in French that Richard recognized as the same ones she murmured during her most intense nightmares. Harold kept his eyes closed, his breathing synchronized with Emma's in a way that defied any medical explanation, while the medal on her chest began to glow with a soft light that couldn't be looked at directly. Richard watched in terrified silence as Emma's fingers began to move for the first time in 6 months. Not randomly, but tracing symbols in the air that mirrored the patterns Harold had made with the medal. The medical equipment began registering brain activity in regions that had remained dormant since the accident, creating patterns that sent doctors rushing into the room with expressions of complete bewilderment. Harold suddenly opened his eyes, revealing dilated pupils that seemed to reflect landscapes that did not exist in the physical world, and whispered in a voice that wasn't entirely his own, "She's trying to tell me something about the night of the accident, Richard." Today, the revelation made Richard's blood run cold, as Harold was suggesting Emma was trying to communicate details about events she supposedly couldn't remember due to the trauma. Emma's lips began moving more intensely, forming silent words that Harold seemed to understand perfectly, translating in real time. "She says it wasn't an accident, Richard. She says you know the truth about what happened that night." The accusation struck Richard like lightning, making him stagger back against the wall as he watched Harold and Emma share a connection that transcended normal human understanding. Harold fully opened his eyes and stared at Richard with an intensity that made the millionaire realize his carefully constructed lies were about to collapse, as the veteran revealed the truth that would change everything. "Richard, Emma isn't in a coma. She's in a cataleptic state due to severe psychological trauma." The revelation hit Richard like a tsunami of reality, as Harold exposed that Emma had consciously withdrawn from the physical world as a defense mechanism against something terrible she had witnessed. "She can hear every word, every conversation, every confession you've made beside this bed over the last 6 months," Harold continued. "And her mind is processing everything while she decides whether it's safe to return to reality." The air in the room grew suffocating as Richard realized Emma had heard all his admissions of guilt, all the details he had whispered, thinking she'd never know. Harold gripped the medal tighter and explained how his near-death experience had given him the ability to recognize different altered states of consciousness, allowing him to distinguish between a true coma and a voluntary psychological withdrawal. "In the corridor between worlds, I learned that the human mind can build prisons more effective than any physical injury," Harold revealed, "and Emma built a mental fortress to protect herself from a truth she wasn't ready to face." Richard's legs buckled as he realized Emma had witnessed something on the night of the supposed accident that was so traumatic her mind had chosen to completely disconnect from reality. The medal began to pulse more intensely, as if responding to the nearness of a truth that had remained buried for too long. The truth about the night of the accident began to unravel when Harold forced Richard to admit that Emma had discovered something devastating about the Sterling family business, something involving money laundering for international criminal organizations. Richard finally confessed through tears that Emma had found documents in his home office proving his involvement in arms trafficking, and that the argument that preceded her fall had been Emma threatening to expose everything to the authorities. "She didn't fall down the stairs," Richard admitted with a broken voice. "I pushed her during the fight, and when I saw she had hit her head, I panicked and made up the story about the accident." Harold watched in silence as Richard revealed how he had bribed doctors and falsified reports to cover up the truth, using his fortune to build a lie that would protect his reputation while Emma remained trapped in her own psychological trauma. The weight of the revelation made Harold understand that Emma had withdrawn from reality, not just because of physical trauma, but because her mind was processing the emotional betrayal of discovering the man she loved was capable of violence and corruption. "She's trapped between the love she still feels for you and the horror of what you've become," Harold explained, "and until that contradiction is resolved, she can't return to a world where she has to choose between turning you in or living with silent complicity." Richard realized he had created a psychological prison for Emma, more effective than any physical cell, one in which she would remain until he found the courage to face the consequences of his actions. The sound of the medical equipment echoed in the room like a metronome ticking off time, lost to lies and squandered chances for redemption. Harold recognized in Emma's breathing patterns and subtle movements the same signs he had learned over years of working with veterans suffering from severe PTSD. He understood she was trapped in a mental loop, reliving the trauma of betrayal and violence over and over. "Emma is fighting an internal war between love and justice," Harold explained to Richard, "and I'm going to use psychological survival techniques I learned in the trenches to help her find a path through this conflict." Harold began whispering to Emma in the same calm and steady voice he had once used to soothe panicked soldiers during combat, creating an emotional anchor that would help her mind navigate the turbulent waters of trauma. He placed the medal on Emma's hand and began telling stories of soldiers who had faced impossible choices between loyalty and morality, drawing parallels that would help her consciousness process the dilemma that had kept her trapped. Richard watched in silence as Harold implemented a technique of gradual desensitization, guiding Emma through traumatic memories in small increments her mind could process without shutting down. "She needs to know there's life beyond the choice of exposing you or protecting you," Harold murmured. "She needs to understand that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and justice doesn't always require destruction." Emma's breathing began to grow deeper and more regular, as if her mind was finally finding peace amid the internal chaos that had imprisoned her for so long. Harold continued his delicate work, knowing that a single wrong move could send Emma even deeper into her psychological fortress, while Richard watched the man he once despised reveal himself as the only person capable of saving the woman he loved. Emma's awakening was gradual and unexpected, her eyes slowly opening as she whispered in French words Harold translated as, "I choose truth over blind love." Richard approached the bed with tears in his eyes, hoping to see the woman he had lost 6 months ago. But Emma looked at him with a mental clarity that made him realize she had become someone completely different during her inner journey. "I heard every word you said beside me," Emma said with a steady voice, "and I've decided our story needs a different ending than the one you planned." Harold watched their encounter with the serenity of someone who had completed a sacred mission, knowing Emma had found the strength to face her new reality. The medal between Emma's fingers glowed one last time before becoming just an ordinary piece of metal, its mystical purpose finally fulfilled. The final revelation left Richard completely unprepared when Emma announced she had used her time in the cataleptic state to recall crucial details about his criminal operations, including names, dates, and locations she had memorized from the documents she had found. "I won't report you to the authorities," Emma said with disturbing calm, "because I've discovered something far more powerful than legal justice. I've discovered how to use your own system against you." Harold realized Emma had developed, during her near-death experience, a profound understanding of psychological manipulation and control, transforming her victimhood into a subtle but devastating weapon. Richard watched in growing horror as Emma explained how she would gradually take control of his empire, not through direct confrontation, but through the same silent manipulation he had once used against her. The homeless veteran who had entered the hospital as a desperate vagrant left transformed into an instrument of fate, knowing he had not only awakened Emma, but unleashed a force that would forever redefine the balance of power within the Sterling legacy.